Make sure that our sound is good. All right, so it looks like we're doing okay. I'm gonna make sure we've got our stream up and running. Is our stream up and running? All right, so it looks like we're doing okay. Okay. Make sure we've got our stream up and running. All right, well, welcome this evening to our Wednesday night Leviticus Bible study for Wednesday, September 9th, 2020. I want to tell you how glad I am to have all of you with us this evening. And let's go ahead and get started. We're going to be in the book of Leviticus this evening. We're going to be in Leviticus chapter 26. I'm sorry. We're going to be in Leviticus chapter 24 and 25. So before we begin, we're going to go ahead and go to the Lord in prayer, and then we'll get down to our study here. Dear Lord, God, I thank you so much for the opportunity that you've given us to come together this evening to study your word. God, I ask that you would be with us this evening to watch over us and keep us. Lord, I ask that you would be with my wife as she's on the road right now in the rain. You get her safely back home here to San Antonio, and that you would be with, just with our community right now as we suffer through, opening schools back up and kids going back to school, and that you would watch over our teachers and our students and the support staff and all of the parents. Lord, I ask these things in your holy name. Amen. Well, this evening we're going to be in the book of Leviticus. We're going to be closing out the book of Leviticus this week and next week. This week we're gonna kind of hit a bunch of different topics. We're going to be looking at everything from the lamps in the tabernacle to the laws concerning the Sabbath year and the year of Jubilee. So let's go ahead and get started. We're going to be in chapter 24, beginning in verse 1. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Command the people of Israel to bring you pure oil from beaten olives for the lamp, that a light may be kept burning regularly outside the veil of the testimony in the tent of meeting. Aaron shall arrange it from the evening to morning and before the Lord regularly. It shall be a statute forever throughout your generations. He shall arrange the lamps on the lampstand of pure gold before the Lord regularly." Now, before we move on, I want to touch on the lamp here. This is kind of a space in between um, where the author of Leviticus, Moses, is kind of taking a brief time out to talk about some of the specifics of how the worship should occur in the tabernacle and some of the day-to-day goings on there. These two sections are going to talk about what day-to-day operations in the tabernacle looked like. And so last week we talked about the flow of the Jewish year, the flow of the Jewish week, and the flow of the Jewish year. And then in the next chapter, we're going to talk about the flow of the Jewish annual calendar and what it looks like in an extended sense. So what it looks like decade to decade and century to century, right? So there's this kind of flow where we're focusing on a very small period of time and then extending it out for generations as generations kind of come and go. And then in between these two sections, there's this small portion that's going to talk about what some of the principles of day-to-day life for Jewish people at the time of the tabernacle and when they came into the land. And the first thing that we see here is this concept of the lamp. And the idea here is that inside the tabernacle. If you guys remember, the tabernacle is a great big tent, and there is a space where the Ark of the Covenant sits, called the Holy of Holies, and nobody goes in there unless you're going to move the tabernacle or move the Ark of the Covenant. Nothing goes in there. Nobody goes in there except for once per year when the high priest goes in with a cloud of incense kind of enveloping him at the Day of Atonement to make atonement for the people. Um, Other than that, everything else happens on the other side of the veil in a place that is holy but less holy than the Holy of Holies. Okay, and so what they're going to talk about is kind of what this looks like, and one of the big things one of the main um, characteristics, one of the main things that you see in this space is the oil lamp. Okay, now many of us have seen the Jewish menorah. That it is one of the kind of the definitive symbols of Israel. It has been for the longest time. So the oil lamp that they're talking about here is a menorah. It is a seven branched candlestick that is going to be in front of the Holy of Holies. It's fed with oil, it burns the oil, and it creates light. But it is so much more than a lamp. It is a symbol of God's light among his people. And there's an interesting element that goes on here. See, the people of Israel feed this lamp with oil. And so it is almost like there is a constant fire in the holy place that is being fed by the people of God through their bringing in sacrifices and oil on their daily basis to keep this thing fed. Now, throughout Jewish history, there is going to be this reoccurring theme of the light on the lampstand. One of the most well known of these is is Hanukkah, which is something that happened in between the Old Testament and the New Testament during a time when the Jewish people had been conquered. And so the Jewish people were conquered by the Greeks under Alexander, who conquered the Persians. And then when Alexander's empire fell apart, the Greek Empire took over. And then when Alexander the Great's empire fell apart, there was a dynasty in Syria that gained control of Israel. And over many, many years, an evil king rose up. His name was Antiochus the Fifth Epiphanes, and he did some really, really terrible things. Made the Jewish people made their lives really, really hard. And so a group of people called the Maccabees fought this massive war against him, in the process of which they celebrated a period of time in the temple where they needed to have oil for their lamp, and God provided oil for the lamp, and it lasted for 7 nights, and it was the symbol of God's provision in the midst of crisis, and it became the symbol for the Jews of God providing, right? God providing to his people what they needed in order to be able to worship him. And so, when we look at this, one of the things that we can take away from it as Christians, and sometimes it's hard when we go through Leviticus to try to understand how is this applicable to us, right? And people have tried to make it applicable in many different ways. And oftentimes it will be through what is called allegory. And allegory is where we say, well, the lampstand symbolizes this, and then the temple symbolizes that, and that's really difficult for us to do, because ultimately what it allows us to do is make these things mean whatever we want them to mean. So what we want to do is we want to look at, instead of trying to read meanings in, we want to try to figure out, what do we see here? Well, I think the clearest thing that we see here is that God has indicated that this lamp will be in the holy place, and that it will be fed by the people. And then there is a role of the people in supporting the worship of him in his temple. There is a role for God's people in the function of worshiping him. And so we all have a responsibility to support his worship and the work that he has going on. This kind of comes forward to where we are now with the fact that the tithes and the offerings that the people of God give to his church keep the lights on. I mean, if you look around me, I'm sitting in an office right now. It's dark outside, and there's light in here because people have brought their tithes and their offerings into the church, and those tithes and offerings have made the light work. Now, and we don't want to draw that out too much, but I think the important thing for us to understand here is that God, just as God has called on us to build our lives around the rhythms of his schedule, he has also called us to build our lives around the rhythms of supporting the worship of him in his holy place. Well, let's keep going on, right? So we'll continue in verse 24. In verse 5, you shall take fine flour and bake 12 loaves from it. 2/10 of an ephah shall be in each loaf. And you shall set them in 2 piles, 6 in a pile, on the table of pure gold before the Lord. And you shall put pure frankincense on each pile, that it may go with the bread as a memorial portion, as a food offering to the Lord. Every Sabbath day, Aaron shall arrange it before the Lord regularly. It is from the people of Israel as a covenant forever. And it shall be for Aaron and his sons, and they shall eat it in a holy place, since it is for him a most holy portion out of the Lord's food offering, a perpetual due. And what we see here, again, this is another thing that's happening in the holy place. The people are bringing flour in, they're making bread out of the flour, and the bread gets placed every day on the what is called the table of the bread of the presence. Okay. The King James Version would call this the showbread, but basically this is bread that is there that also comes from the people's sacrifices, and it's bread that is then consumed at the end of the day. The priests would take the bread and they would go and they would consume it uh, inside the tabernacle, and this is a way that God's people are worshiping God and providing for His priests. Now we get to kind of a weird place in the text. We're coming up on a passage that has been, for me, one of the most difficult to understand, and in many ways one of the most disconcerting passages that we have in Scripture. This is about the punishment of a young man for blaspheming God. Now, an Israelite woman's son, whose father was an Egyptian. Now, so understand what we have going on here. This is a Jewish woman, an Israelite woman, who, for whatever reason and in whatever time, married an Egyptian man. And so we got to remember here, we're probably less than a year from when Israel has left Egypt. Okay. And so this is a woman whose husband has decided to come with her out into the desert. And this is about her son. So now an Israelite woman's son, whose father was an Egyptian, went out among the people of Israel. So I take that back. This is a woman whose son has come with her. We don't know what happened to the Egyptian dad. Maybe he died during one of the many rebellions that they had in the desert. Maybe he just didn't go with them. But this is a single mom with her son. And the Israelites woman's son and a man of Israel fought in the camp. And the Israelites woman's son blasphemed the name and cursed. And then they brought him to Moses. His mother's name was Shelomith, and the daughter of Derby of the tribe of Dan. And they put him in custody till the will of the Lord could be clear to them. Okay, and so this woman, this single mom's son, has gotten into a fight with some of the local boys, and in the process, he's blasphemed God and he's cursed. And then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Bring out of the camp the one who cursed, and let all who hear him lay their hands on his head, and let all the congregation stone him, and speak to the people of Israel, saying, Whoever curses his God shall bear his sin. Whoever blasphemes the name of the Lord shall surely be put to death, and all the congregants shall stone him, the sojourner as well as the native. When he blasphemes the name, he shall be put to death. Whoever takes a human life shall surely be put to death. Whoever takes an animal's life shall make good for that life. If anyone injures his neighbor as he has done, it shall be done to him. Fracture for fracture, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. Whatever injury he has given a person shall be given to him. Whoever kills an animal shall make it good, and whoever kills a person shall be put to death. You shall have the same rule for the sojourner and for the native, for I am the Lord your God. And so Moses spoke to the people of Israel, and they brought out of the camp the one who had cursed and stoned him with stones. Thus the people of God of Israel did as the Lord commanded them. Now listen, when I read this for the first time, to me, it was one of the most disturbing things that I read, because in this, we see a deeply personal tragedy come to us over the thousands of years. This is a woman, we don't know where her husband is, but she has her only son, and the only son does something stupid. He says something stupid in the heat of anger, and he pays for it with his life. And it's not just paying for it with his life, it is paying for it with his life in an incredibly visceral and violent way. Look at the language here. The people who have accused him will put their hands on his head, and then the congregation of Israel will stone him to death. And we can just imagine what this must have been like as these other boys who, for whatever reason, had gotten into an altercation with him and then told on him to the authorities, um, have to stand there with their hand on his head while the people around them come up with stones and literally bludgeon this man until he is unconscious, and then past that until he is dead, while his mother probably sits off to the side screaming and crying and begging for mercy, and they beat this man to death. And as I read that, I just think to myself, why? Why have that? It seems so senseless. It seems so pointless. It seems so merciless. But we're told why. We're told that you shall have the same rule for the sojourner and for the native, for I am the Lord your God. We are so used to thinking about God as forgiving, as merciful, and He is forgiving and merciful. But sometimes we can confuse that mercy and that forgiveness with flippancy. And we can get into our minds the idea that God doesn't care about sin, that God just, gets over sin. The reality is, all sin is treason against God. And so, in what is probably representative of the justice meted out to so many people in that camp, God demands holiness from his people. The more I think of this, I don't think, oh, how merciless is God. I think to myself, how merciful is God that he has not utterly destroyed us for the filthiness of our speech. And I mean myself as well, or even maybe foremost, that my speech is not salted with only words, that I say things that I shouldn't say. Like Isaiah, oh, woe is me. I'm a man of unclean lips, and I live among a people of unclean lips, and my eyes have seen the glory of the Lord. We must never forget that while our God is immanent and he wants a relationship with us and he loves us, he is a terrible God. And it is a terrible thing to fall into the hands of an angry God. And so this young man became an example of what God's justice and holiness look like. Not just for the people in the camp, not just for the Israelites, but for everyone who sojourned with them. All of the people that came out of Egypt with them were being honed by God into a holy people, a people who would be able to go and take the land that he was about to give them. And so, with this kind of brief stop in the midst of this story, we begin to see the nature of life as a regular Israelite. We've spent all this time talking about the priests and all this time talking about the tabernacle, but now they're talking about what everyday Israelites lived. Every day they were bringing oil into the tabernacle. Every day they were bringing flour to make these cakes, and every day they lived with the sure understanding that they were in the presence of God and that their actions had consequences, very real consequences. And just as Nadab and Abihu were killed for bringing profane fire into the holy place, so any one of these Israelites could die if he took the Lord's name in vain. The commandments that God had laid on them carried with them an incredibly deep and meaningful penalty. But we move on now, though. And we move on to probably what is one of the most interesting passages in Scripture. And that is the law of the Sabbath year. You see, God did not just give them moral laws, and He didn't give them just sacrificial laws and cleanliness laws. He also gave them a series of laws that were based on land use. And the way that they were to interact with the land and the way that they were interact with each other. In verse 1 of chapter 25, we read, "And the Lord spoke to Moses on Mount Sinai, saying, Speak to the people of Israel and say to them, When you come into the land that I give you, the land shall keep a Sabbath to the Lord." Now think about that for a second. God has given men a Sabbath, like one day in seven to rest. But now he's saying that not only will I give man a Sabbath, not only do you need a rest, but my creation needs a rest. God is breathing into his people's life this concept of rest. It says, "For 6 years you shall sow your field, and for 6 years you shall prune your vineyards and gather its fruits. But on the seventh year there shall be a Sabbath of solemn rest for the land, a Sabbath to the Lord. You shall not sow your field or prune your vineyard. You shall not reap what grows of its. You shall not reap what grows of itself in your harvest, or gather the grapes of your undressed vines. It shall be a year of solemn rest for the land. The Sabbath of the land shall provide food for you, for yourself, and for your male and female slaves, and for your hired workers and the sojourners who live with you, for you and for your cattle and the wild animals that are in your land. All its yield shall be food." Okay? Um, so just think about what they're saying here. This is an agricultural people, and God is telling them that for 6 years, you sow and you reap, right? You plant seed in the ground, the crop comes up, you harvest that crop, and then you eat that crop. Oil, uh, grapes, wheat, fruit, everything. But on the seventh year, you're not to plant anything. You're not to trim any of your grape vines. You're not to do anything in the land. You're literally to give the land a Sabbath. And while they can eat from the land, they can't trim it or husband it in any way. The land is left completely fallow. Can you imagine what an act of faith it must take for an agricultural people who live at the edge of starvation anyway to give an entire year's worth of planting away, to just not do anything? And yet God promises them that the produce from the land will be enough to be able to feed them. And the idea here is that they will have so much surplus from the year before, and the land itself is so fertile that they will be able to eat from it. Because think about it like this: it's not just the year that they sow and reap. It's the next year as well, because they have to be able to have seed to be able to plant, and they've got to have food to be able to eat while they wait for the food to come up. And so this is a tremendous act of faith on the part of the Israelites. But it's also a way of keeping them from overworking the land. It's a way of keeping them from abusing the land to the point where it just becomes arid, an arid wasteland, as they overuse it and the land becomes depleted. In essence, they're leaving the entire land fallow for an entire year, and the land is able to recover. Now, as kind of shocking as that may seem, the next part is even more shocking. So think about it. 1 day in 7, the people rest. 1 year in 7, the land and everybody in it rests. It says, you shall count 7 weeks of years, 7 times 7 years, so that the time of 7 weeks of years shall give you 49 years. Okay, so that's kind of a complicated way of saying you're going to do 6 years in a Sabbath. You're going to do that 7 times. Okay, 7 times 7 is 49. Shall give you 49 years. And you shall sound the loud trumpet on the 10th day of the 7th month. On the day of atonement, you shall sound the trumpet throughout your land, and it shall be consecrated the 50th year, and proclaim liberty throughout the land to all its inhabitants. It shall be a jubilee for you when each of you shall return to his property, and each of you shall return to his clan. That 50th year shall be a jubilee for you. In it you shall neither sow nor reap what grows of itself, nor gather the grapes from the undressed vines, for it is a jubilee. It shall be holy to you. You may eat the produce of the field. In this year, the jubilee, each of you shall return to his property. And if you make a sale to your neighbor or buy from your neighbor, you shall not wrong one another. You shall pay your neighbor according to the number of years after the jubilee, and he shall sell you according to the number of years for crops. If the years are many, you shall increase the price. And if the years are few, you shall reduce the price, for it is the number of the crops that he is selling you. You shall not wrong one another, but you shall fear God. Therefore, you shall do my statutes and keep my rules and perform them. Then you will dwell in the land securely. The land will yield its fruit, and you will enter in your fill and dwell in it securely. And if you say, what shall we eat on the 7th year, if we may not sow or gather in our crop? And this is what the Lord says. I will command my blessing on you in the 6th year, so that it will produce a crop sufficient for 3 years. When you sow in the 8th year, you will be eating some of the old crops. You shall eat the old until the 9th year when the crop arrives. So I want you to just think what they're doing here. So every 49 years, every 50 years, instead of 1 Sabbath year, they're taking 2 Sabbath years. Okay? So now, instead of just taking 1 year off from the land, the year is getting 2 years. The land is getting 2 years off. And the people are being forced to live for pretty much 3 years on what comes out of the ground on that 49th year, which is yet an even bigger act of faith. But this is going to be even more disconcerting. It's going to be even more disruptive. See, because it's not just the land going fallow. That 50th year mark, that year of Jubilee, is kind of a reset. Everything gets canceled. Right? We're going to go ahead and read through this, but all of the land reverts to the people that owned it. This is a critically important concept that is very, very alien to us living in a Western culture. In the culture that we live in, if I buy something, it's mine. If I buy a piece of land, that land is mine, and I give that land to my children, and they give it to their children, and to their children, and to their children. The land, and then if my children sell it, then that land stays sold, and it goes to somebody else. This can be very good in a society. In some societies, people were able to gather together pieces of land, make them very, very productive, which can be very good for creating large crops. It's also really bad because it creates an underclass and poor people and all kinds of income inequality issues and issues that capitalism has struggled with. that we still struggle with. In ancient Israel, though, it was a very, very different situation. See, in ancient Israel, the land didn't belong to the people. The land belonged to God. And like a feudal lord, like the king, he parceled out his land to the different tribes. Every tribe was given a piece of land, and every family in every tribe was given a parcel of land. And that parcel of land was enough to feed that group of people. Now, let's say you had a piece of land in that particular tribal area, in that parcel. You could sell that land to somebody else. But on the year of Jubilee, all of the land was returned to the people who had originally owned it. So, in essence, there was no buying and selling of land. You really just rented the land from other people. This is what he says in verse 23. The land shall not be sold in perpetuity, for the land is mine. For you are strangers and sojourners with me. And in all the country you possess, you shall allow a redemption of the land. If your brother becomes poor and sells part of his property, then his nearest redeemer shall come and redeem what his brother has sold. If a man has no one to redeem it, and then himself becomes prosperous and finds sufficient means to redeem it, let him calculate the years since he sold it, and pay back the balance to the man whom he sold it, and then return to his property. But if he does not have sufficient means to recover it, then what he sold shall remain in the hand of the buyer until the year of Jubilee. In the Jubilee it shall be released, and he shall return to his property. Uh, this is fascinating to me. I have spent my entire life growing up in suburbs, and for most of you, you have done the same. I live in a house on a piece of property that used to be a ranch. A guy used to own all of Stone Oak. Um, and it would be as if 50 years after Stone Oak was made, that rancher would come back and say, okay, cool, all this land is now mine again. And you guys go back to the land that you owned. And so I would go back to Rosenberg and go back to our family home there. And everybody would kind of go back to the places that they had come from. It is almost like the land has a reset. Everything goes back to the way it was right when God gave the people his land. And he builds this generational reset into the rhythms of the people's lives. It says, if a man sells a dwelling house in a walled city, he may redeem it within a year of its sale. For a full year, he shall have the right of redemption. But if it is not redeemed within a full year, then the house in the walled city shall belong in perpetuity to the buyer throughout his generations. It shall not be released in the Jubilee. But the houses of the villages that have no walls around them shall be classified with the fields of the land. They may be redeemed, and they shall be released in the Jubilee. As for the cities of the Levites may redeem at any time the houses in the cities they possess. And if one of the Levites exercises his right of redemption, then the house that was sold in the city, they shall be released in the Jubilee. For the houses of the cities of the Levites are their possessions among the people of Israel. But the fields of pasture land belong to their cities and may not be sold, for their possession is forever. And so again, we see this. The laws are a little bit different in the cities. If you own a house in a walled city, then you can sell it. But all of the houses outside in the villages go back to the original owners. And we continue on here. There are all kinds of provisions for poor brothers, how the poor brother can be redeemed even if he's sold into slavery, how they redeem the slaves. And so at the time of the Jubilee, those who had been sold into slavery for debt would be redeemed. And they would be free. And so as we come kind of to the end of Leviticus, we have one chapter left. It's critical that we understand that the ethic and the economics of God's kingdom is fundamentally different from anything that we really have ever seen. It is this idea that God owns everything, and God's people are holding these things in trust for God. God can decide how these things are used, and He then can determine when they go back to their original owners. And I wonder for us, what would our lives be like if we actually treated our possessions as if they belonged to God, as if we were just simply holding them in trust for God? What would that look like in the way that we think about our homes? What would that look like in the way that we treat our money? What would that look like in the way that we treat our time? Um, we have become a people that increasingly see everything that we have as belonging to ourselves, to the point where we are inconvenienced by any implication that God has any claim on those things. But dear brother and sister, God owns everything. He owns the cattle on 1,000 hills. He owns your home. He holds your job in the palm of his hand. He can determine what he wants done with them. Now, thankfully, we have a God who allows us to use the overflow of his riches to be able to support ourselves. And he asks for simply a small portion of it back to himself. But it's incredibly important that we actually do that we actually honor God by giving back to him a portion of our time and a portion of the treasure that he's given us. That we live our lives constantly in his presence. And this is, I think, the main message of Leviticus is that part of being God's people means living in God's presence. That being God's people means living in such a way that everything that we do is dedicated to him, that we make all of our lives holy by consecrating everything that we do to him. I just want you to stop for a moment and think, what would it look like to consecrate every aspect of your life to God? We've already talked about money. What does it look like to consecrate your money to God? Well, it looks like, at the very least, tithing, giving a tenth of what God has given to you for the support of his church. But it's more than that. It's determining how you're going to spend the money, the rest of the money that God's given you. Are you going to live continually in debt because you seek things that to define yourself that you don't need, that you seek luxury that you don't need, and instead use the wealth that God's given you so that you can bless the people around you. But it's more than that, right? It's seeing your house as a gift that you have been placed as a steward of. So many of us treat our houses like our castles. They are the place that we retreat to. I can remember walking around neighborhoods back when I was in Houston. I would walk around these neighborhoods in Sugarland, and they were these beautiful houses with amazing balconies and and just very lovely yards, and no one was ever in them. Now, partly that was because it was Houston, and Houston is miserable in the summertime. But I can remember thinking to myself, these are just places that people go to hide inside, to just watch their TV and hide from the world. One of the awesome things about COVID is how often now I see my neighbors out on the street and we talk to them. Well, brothers and sisters, is your house the refuge that you run from the world to? Or is it the place that God has given you to be hospitable? Now, there's risk every time we take people into our homes, every time we invite company over. Oh, brother, oh, sister, can we take our houses and use them to glorify God by inviting God's people to them, to making them places where the lost can come into contact with Christ? In several weeks, we're going to begin doing a small group ministry here at Oak Ridge Baptist Church. We're going to begin moving our Bible studies out into our communities. Are you willing to share your home? Are you willing to share your life with the people around you so that they can get to know Christ? Listen to me. We don't have to bring oil into the tabernacle to feed the lamps, and we don't have to make cakes of flour. We don't have to celebrate the seven festivals or celebrate the Jubilee year, but we celebrate the one who the Jubilee year pointed to. We celebrate Christ, and we do it every day. Every day you can go into the presence of God, and every day you can take your home and your money and your food and everything that you possess, and you can turn them to glorify God by creating a space where God can be glorified in your life. See, as with so much in the new covenant, Christ has come to fulfill the Old Testament law, but that doesn't make things easier. In many ways, it makes them more all encompassing. Instead of having one place in the encampment that is holy, now all of our hearts are the tabernacle, and all of our homes are the holy places. So, as we prepare to finish this evening, I want you to think about how you can take your life and build your life around the rhythms of God's grace. How you can take your life and you can devote it every day to the worship of God through your actions towards the people around you. How you can take your entire life and consecrate it for service. Because, brothers and sisters, we are all priests. We are all priests in the tabernacle of God's mercy. And brothers and sisters, I'm so glad that we had the opportunity to meet this evening and to talk about the book of Leviticus. I have gained so much from studying this, and I hope you have too. We have one more lesson left. That is going to be on chapter 26. So I hope you join me next week at the same time on Facebook Live as we go through Leviticus 26 and finish up this study. Good night, and God bless you all.